The wind blew gently through the bamboo of the mountain temple. The breeze, almost imperceptible, moved the leaves with a murmur so faint that it seemed to be part of the very silence that reigned in that place. Monk Kaito sat by the lake, watching its still surface. His breathing was slow, barely a whisper blending into the air. He had spent years searching for an answer, but he had learned that questions fade when silence embraces them. An old fisherman approached, slowly dragging his wet net. Kaito looked at him without speaking. The old man smiled and, without stopping, let the net fall into the water. In that instant, the monk's reflection in the lake shattered into 1,000 ripples. Kaito blinked. There was something profoundly meaningful in that simple act, but he did not try to grasp it. He simply breathed, letting the moment slip away like water through his fingers. Silence, he thought, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something more. The old fisherman calmly pulled in his net. Kaito watched as droplets of water fell from the knots, one by one, returning to the lake without hurry. Each drop disappeared into the vastness of the water, leaving no trace. The water never clings to anything, the fisherman said without looking at the monk, but everything returns to it. Kaito inclined his head slightly. There was no intention to teach in those words, yet something about them resonated within him. Silence is the same, the old man continued. It is not emptiness, but space for everything to happen without resistance. Kaito lowered his gaze and picked up a smooth stone from the ground. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight, its coolness, its shape. Then, without much thought, he let it fall into the lake. The stone vanished, and ripples spread out until they reached the shore. The fisherman nodded. Everything that enters the water leaves a trace, but the water always returns to stillness. The monk closed his eyes. His master used to tell him that the mind is like a lake. If we disturb it, ripples spread uncontrollably. But if we allow silence to embrace it, clarity returns on its own. At that moment, a breeze swept across the water's surface, smoothing the last ripples. Kaito exhaled slowly. The old fisherman walked away without another word, leaving Kaito alone by the lake. The monk remained still, his breath synchronized with the gentle sway of the water. The sun slowly descended, painting the horizon in amber and violet. Kaito remembered his master's teachings. Silence is not the absence of words, but the space where truth can reveal itself. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the stillness. A fish leapt above the surface and plunged back into the water with a faint splash. The moment had been brief, but its echo expanded in the monk's mind like ripples in the lake. In his youth, Kaito would have sought to interpret this, would have tried to find a hidden meaning. But now he simply breathed and let the moment be what it was. He rose serenely and began walking toward the temple. Each step on the gravel made a subtle sound, a whisper that did not disturb the silence but accompanied it. The wind rose again, caressing the trees and carrying away the last light of day. Kaito smiled slightly. Silence had a breath of its own, ever present, always flowing. Upon reaching the temple, Kaito stopped at the entrance. The wood of the ancient structure creaked slightly under his weight, as if acknowledging his presence. Inside, the glow of an oil lamp cast wavering shadows on the walls. He sat in his usual spot by the rock garden. Before him, the lines drawn in the sand formed patterns that the wind had begun to erase. Each night, the monks redrew those lines, but inevitably, time and the breeze would undo them. So is the mind, Kaito thought. No matter how much we strive to arrange it, something will always come to unsettle it. He took the wooden rake and, with slow movements, redrew the grooves in the sand. He did not do it to correct anything but to remember that each trace was ephemeral. like his own breath. From the main hall, the sound of a bell rang out. Its sound expanded through the temple, vibrant at first, then fainter, until it disappeared into the air. Kaito closed his eyes. There was no sorrow in the disappearance of the sound, nor in the wind erasing the lines in the sand. There was only flow, change, continuity. Silence, he thought, is not something to be sought. It is already here in everything that comes and goes. He took a deep breath. Outside, the night was beginning to spread its veil over the mountain. The night breeze flowed through the temple's corridors, slipping its breath through the rice paper doors. Kaito remained motionless by the rock garden, his gaze lost in the dance of shadows the moon cast upon the sand. Suddenly, a sound interrupted the stillness. Light footsteps on the wooden floor. A young apprentice appeared at the entrance, bowing respectfully. "Master Kaito," he said calmly, "I have a question." The monk looked up, inviting him to continue. "I have tried to quiet my mind, but the more I try, the noisier it becomes. How can I find true silence?" Kaito gazed at him for a moment, then pointed to the oil lamp beside him. "If you try to stop the flame with your hands, what happens?" The young man frowned. "It will flicker more, or go out." Kaito nodded. "The same happens with the mind. If you force it to be silent, it stirs even more. If you reject it, it fades into the darkness of unconsciousness. Silence is not something you attain, but something you dissolve into." The apprentice remained silent, reflecting. The monk took the rake and drew a line in the sand, then blew gently. The breeze erased the trace in an instant. "When you stop fighting the noise, silence reveals itself," Kaito said, watching the young man with a faint smile. The apprentice nodded with gratitude and bowed before departing. Kaito looked at the sand again. The wind had already erased his line completely. He took a deep breath. Silence was there. It had always been there. The moon rose high in the sky, pouring its silver light over the temple rooftops. Kaito remained by the stone garden, his breath synchronized with the rhythm of the night. Silence was not absence. It was not emptiness. It was something alive, pulsating, like the soft murmur of leaves swaying in the wind, like the very heartbeat within. He closed his eyes and let the sensation envelop him. Then he remembered a moment from his youth, when he was still an apprentice, restless and full of questions. One night, his master had taken him to the mountain's summit. Without saying a word, they sat on the grass, gazing at the infinite sky. Kaito had expected a teaching, an instruction, but his master only watched the stars. After a while, impatience overcame him. "Master, what am I supposed to learn here?" he asked. The old man looked at him and then pointed to the sky. "Do you hear that?" Kaito frowned. "I don't hear anything." His master smiled. Exactly. Back then, he hadn't fully understood those words. But now, so many years later, sitting in the temple under the same moon, the truth revealed itself with clarity. Silence is not something one finds. It is something one learns to rest in. He slowly opened his eyes. The night wind brushed his face gently, as if the universe itself whispered its ancient secret. He smiled faintly. The hours passed with the slowness of a leaf floating in the current. Kaito remained seated, his body still, but his awareness fully awake. The night air carried the scent of pines and the distant murmur of the river in the valley. Without warning, a stronger gust of wind stirred the garden. The oil lamp flickered, and the sand lifted into tiny golden clouds. Kaito observed without reacting. A moment later, the breeze settled. Everything returned to stillness. Such was the mind. Such were thoughts. He recalled an old master who, when young monks asked how to calm their minds, would simply say, Listen to the wind. If they sat in silence long enough, they understood. The wind had no origin or destination, yet it never ceased to flow, could not be grasped or stopped, could only be felt. Silence was the same. Kaito stood up gently and walked along the wooden corridor, his steps barely making a sound in the vastness of the night. He made his way to the highest pavilion of the temple, where the horizon stretched without limits. Upon arrival, he paused at the threshold. Before him, the night sky unfolded like an endless ocean of shimmering stars. He took a deep breath. In that instant, he understood with absolute clarity. Silence is not a space between sounds, but the essence of all things. The firmament stretched before him like an infinite canvas. Each star flickered with the same calm in which thoughts arose and vanished in his mind. Kaito sat on the wooden floor, letting the immensity of the night envelop him. In that moment, there were no questions or answers, only the simple truth of being there, breathing, existing. A soft sound broke the stillness, the creak of wood underfoot. The old fisherman appeared in the dim light. Without speaking, he sat beside Kaito, looking at the same sky. They remained there for a long time with no need for words. Finally, the fisherman exhaled deeply. "All my life, I have cast my nets into the water," he said with a serene voice. "Sometimes I caught fish, sometimes I only brought back emptiness." He paused before continuing. "At first, it troubled me when the net came back empty. Over time, I understood that the water always returned what I needed, even if it wasn't what I expected." Kaito listened in silence. "Silence is the same," the fisherman continued. "It does not always give us what we seek, but it always offers what is." The night wind blew gently, carrying his words far beyond the temple, beyond the valley. Kaito closed his eyes. The truth was not found in grand speeches or complex explanations. It was in the simple acceptance of each moment, in surrendering to the natural flow of all things. And in that flow, silence breathed. The night advanced unhurriedly. The old fisherman and Kaito remained seated in the temple's high pavilion, embraced by the vastness of the moment. At last, the fisherman rose to his feet. "It is time to return," he said with a slight smile. Kaito nodded but remained in place. The old man did not insist. He simply bowed slightly and walked away with the same ease with which he had arrived. His steps faded into the breeze. Kaito closed his eyes once more. Everything was as it should be. The sky, the wind, the soft rustling of the leaves. He remembered his master's words. "When you finally understand silence, you will realize it was never far from you." For years, he had sought serenity in meditation, in sacred texts, in the teachings of wise men. But now, he understood that silence was not something to be found because it had never been lost. He stood up slowly. The floorboards groaned softly under his weight. He walked back through the temple's corridor, each step in harmony with the night. The echo of his footsteps soon faded, leaving only the breath of silence. Dawn began to paint the horizon with hues of amber and crimson. The morning breeze caressed the temple trees, and the murmur of the waking world mingled with the lingering silence of the night. Kaito paused at the pavilion's threshold, gazing at the rising light. Within him, there was nothing to desire, nothing to resist. He was simply there, like the wind, like the water, like the infinite sky. In the distance, the old fisherman cast his net into the river once more. Kaito watched him without needing to understand anything beyond what was already evident. Life continued its course, effortlessly, without resistance. He took a deep breath. Silence was not a goal nor a destination. It was not something to be possessed. It was the very essence of each moment, the invisible breath that gave life to all things. He smiled faintly and stepped forward, descending from the pavilion. The day had begun, and with it, silence kept breathing.